Carol, welcome.
Hey, it is so exciting to be here.
I'm really excited too. We were just noting that it's 10 years now that we have exchanged electronic communication, but never actually spoken. And that seems quite a
Yeah,
long time.
and I've looked back at some of our emails because I was curious, like how long have I been in correspondence and with Daniel? And yeah, 10 years and quite interesting exchanges that we've had. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you.
Well, likewise, you really turned me on, I think, to the idea of writing about yoga seriously without being a scholar.
Oh,
Your
really?
book,
Cool.
well, yeah, your book seemed to have this, talking right about the first one, I suppose, Yoga PhD. I mean, first one
Mm,
in yoga terms. Obviously, you had other
right.
publications beforehand, but you seem to have deliberately eschewed attempts to shoehorn you into a commercial idea of what would be a suitable yoga book. You'd been perhaps a little upstaged by some scholars who'd written things that had attempted to write the broad sweep yoga history in North America, and instead just decided you wanted to tell your story your way about your relationship with yoga, but to do that, with rigor and with seriousness. And everything I saw you writing online, 10 years ago, and perhaps even before that, was similarly grounded in being serious about things. It wasn't just an attempt to drive traffic or generate controversy like a lot of people who've been writing about yoga online. And it was grounded in a serious inquiry. You had questions and you wanted answers, and you were a researcher, so you were good at getting them. So I found your work really inspiring in that respect.
Well, thank you. That's really sweet. I appreciate it.
So I wanted to ask you, first of all, kind of
Mhm.
what sucked you in? How did you get so deeply immersed in yoga that you were an authority online on the subject?
Yeah, well, I'll try to keep the story relatively short. But way back in the mid 90s, I was teaching, I was a political science professor at McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota. And that's when I started my first weekly yoga class. So that was way back in the day, right? Where that class was in a church basement. There weren't any yoga studios. I think even in Chicago, there were two yoga studios at that time. And I live in Chicago now, and I'm originally from the Chicago area, so that's why I mentioned Chicago. And it was, I don't know, I just had this feeling like this is something I want to do. This is something I should do, just sort of an intuitive draw to this. And I had no background whatsoever in anything having to do with mind body practices. And the word spirituality, it would be something I was allergic to. I was an academic, very rationalistic. That was my comfort zone. And slowly from that class in the church basement, it just started to grow. It was like a seed was planted, and it went from, okay, I'll do a little stretching once a week to kind of complement my running and whatever else I did for physical health. It just grew slowly until, and I wrote about this in my yoga PhD book, um, a turning point came when I connected with Anna Forrest's method of teaching, which just for various reasons I can go into, but the integration of a strong physical practice, working with mental concentration and really rigorous breathing practices throughout your asana practice, just really started opening things up for me. And I started having some experiences through yoga. And this was probably, gosh, I mean, this is a good 7 years after I'd started that class in the church basement. So it was a
Hmm.
slow evolution, but all of a sudden things started really shifting. And I just had some really arresting experiences, and I got very intrigued. And I understood that this practice was opening up parts of my self that I hadn't accessed before, and that this felt very important. And then basically, I had gone from academia to working in the not-for-profit sector as a researcher. So I was doing applied social research on issues having to do with low-income children and families primarily. So kind of, well, I've always been in that sort of do-gooder liberal progressive camp until recently. We can talk about that later.
We'll get there, I'm sure.
And so I was doing that, and then things kind of blew up at the institute I was working with in a very unexpected way. And I had the opportunity to do a teacher training with Anna Forrest, which is, or was at least at that time, this was 2008, 3.5 weeks of complete immersion. You came in at 6 a.m., you were there for 12 hours, you went home, like showered, ate, you had homework, and you went back. It was just like kind of insane
And
setup,
she's pretty
but
intense as well, huh?
it had a real impact on me and just accelerated the whole process. And much to my surprise, I eventually then made the decision that, yeah, I was going to pursue this more. My work situation had changed. I was and remain married to a tenured professor, so I had some economic security to kind of go off the beaten path, and that's important. So yeah, I decided that I would pursue my interest really, and that meant integrating my academic background and also my interest in kind of positive social change, let's just say, which had run through my academic work and also my nonprofit research and so on, into the yoga world. So I was both learning about it for myself and all the changes I felt that were happening in me in terms of opening myself up, in particular beyond somebody who was very, like I said, very like comfortable in a very rationalistic space and not so comfortable with feeling, intuition, I don't know, like the spiritual realm. I was very uncomfortable with all that stuff. So it opened that up. I was very interested in the integration process of these different parts of myself and also of yoga in the world, because it was really taking off at that time. So that, hopefully in more or less of a nutshell, is kind of what launched me on the path of starting to write seriously about yoga. And that was all, I really started that back in 2010.
And that was part of the process of thinking about writing a book, if I remember rightly. You were talking to an agent who suggested it, if I've got that right.
No, I had, so this was, there's a lighting problem. So
Don't
this
worry.
was, I started being interested in this seriously after my teacher training in 2008. And I looked around, and at that point I realized, hey, there's no books. At that time, there were no books on these questions I was interested in, like how did yoga come to North America? How is it integrating into this society? What was that history? This was before Mark Singleton's book came out, before Stephanie Steinman's book came out, etc. And so I was like, oh, here's an opportunity. I had a background. I'd already written a book, an academic book on race and American liberalism. So I felt like this was something I could do. And again, this was sort of the territory I was familiar with, So I conceived more of a history, kind of a social history of yoga. And I actually did market it to book agents, and I got a contract, so I had approached a variety of people. I got a good contract. I was starting out on that. And then Mark's book came out. And Stephanie's book came out. All these books was like, Philip Goldberg, he had a book. So all these books came
American
out. Like,
Vader,
and I had read Mark's dissertation. So I knew he was working on this because I had researched it. But I didn't know, what his plans were post that. And so when I saw all that, I thought my project has really been done, and at the same time, actually, you're taking me back. I'm remembering all this stuff. I got into social media and blogging because my agent, who I had found for the book that was never written, because it was written by other people, essentially, said, you've got to get on social media. Like, if you want to market this book, the way things are now, you need a blog, you need to be on Twitter, you need to be on Facebook, you need to do this stuff, and you need to start now. And I was just like, what? Are you kidding me? And I had a lot of trepidation. I remember going on Twitter for the first time, just kind of like, oh, it just, I didn't grow up with it. It felt very weird. But quickly, I found that at that time, of course, this all changed. At that time, social media was working for me so well. Like I started blogging in 2010. I set up my own little platform on WordPress, I think it was, Blogspot. It's free. And why is my hand up?
I don't
Did I
know.
do
I think so.
that?
we can lower it for you.
Okay, I'm gonna ignore that.
Let's do it.
A Zoom thing. See if I can get it down. Lower hand. I have no
Well
idea.
done.
See, I'm still not that great with technology, but so I started my blog, which I called Think Body Electric, which was after Walt Whitman. I sing the body electric, and it was supposed to, I don't know, like be sort of literary and sort of fun and sort of pointing to the idea that you could integrate something more intellectual and something more almost esoteric about, really tapping into the body through yoga, but also the mind, etc. So
And also East Western. I mean, that was one of
East
the
West, yes,
this fusion.
yeah,
He read the Gita, if
totally.
I remember rightly, before writing Leaves of Grass.
Yeah, and so I was researching that whole history with the American transcendentalists and their connection and their inspiration through the then at that time new access to these sacred Indian texts. So I was learning about all that exactly, and I remember the blogging world then was really fertile and creative and open. And so within 6 weeks of starting to do this, I had people calling me, and like it just took off, but in a really good way. Like people were interested. There was sort of a emergent conversation. Other people, just like the books that had been written about the history, other people were interested in some of the same questions I was interested in. The internet allowed us to find each other, because like there might not be a lot of people. I was living in Chicago then, in my local community, who wanted to talk about this stuff. But if you could tap into a worldwide network of English speakers, there were a lot of people. And so the internet allowed me to connect to this really interesting community. And there was a period that lasted a couple of years with just these very wide-ranging discussions on, blog posts. There were other I had a whole list of bloggers I was following. We started connecting in real life through conferences and whatever, phone calls, emailing, and things just took off. It was a really kind of wonderful, and for me, completely unexpected time, because I was just like still sort of figuring out, like, how do I move out of being somebody who's used to be an academic or a professional who writes professional reports, which are very like structured. There's a certain language you have to use. There's clear boundaries. There's a way you present yourself. And I was trying to leave all that behind and just really enter this new, very much emerging at the time, conversation and world, which was much more informal. And, it didn't really have rules and structure and all that, which at the time was really great. It worked really well until it stopped working well. Yeah.
Well, before we get onto that, which I really do want to
Yeah.
talk about, it seemed that was captured in the book that you edited with Roseanne Harvey. It was almost like a snapshot of that blogging world, because the styles, the subject matter, and the interests of the contributors were so diverse. It was almost the kind of book that a publisher would have stayed away from, because it was so diverse. They'd have said, try and shoehorn it all through some kind of beigifying influence that will make everything the same. And it was, I think, therefore likely to speak to a much wider audience as a result. I'm curious as to what response you got to the book as the editor. Were people contacting you to talk about the curation of the book, or were they more interested in speaking to the writers of the different chapters?
So that book was a great project. That book, sorry, I'm just adjusting my camera, see if I can get it to look a little better. I guess it's hopeless. Anyway, so that book came 100% out of this blogging experience I just described. So I connected with Roseanne Harvey, the co-editor, through blogging. I was a big admirer of her blog, which was called It's All Yoga Baby. And she had been one of the first people to really start delving into the issues that interested me, sort of yoga and society, the sort of serious part, but also like the serious part in terms of sort of mind, body, spirit connection, what people were experiencing, but then also kind of the social part and how that translates in as something becomes more commercialized and, is kind of entering into the mainstream of society, what's happening. She was really interested in those questions, great writer. She used to work for Ascent, which was a Canadian yoga magazine, but more serious intellectually than Yoga Journal. So a great magazine, but they folded. And so I connected with her through blogging. And then I had the idea, I connected with all these other people. And so I suggested to Roseanne, like, we could do this together and sort of pull in some of the really interesting writers we see in the blogging world at this time, work with them to develop what was a blog post into more of a robust essay, edit it and publish it as a book. So we just self-published it, so that cut out all the questions of dealing with, commercial book publishers, and also sped up the timeline quite a bit. And so she was enthusiastic and we did that. In terms of the reception was very positive, and it was all sorts of things happened. I mean, a lot of those people, some of them were already well established in whatever they were doing, like Tommy Rosen, he wrote about yoga and addiction, and he already had a whole world that was well established in that area. But other people like Chelsea Roth, that was the first time she wrote about her quite harrowing experiences with anorexia. And so she had this amazing story. And it was the first time she went public with it. And so things really took off for her as an individual after that was published. And she now has this, or has had for a long time, a nonprofit, Eat, Breathe, Thrive, that works with people struggling with eating disorders and yoga and other, I don't know to what extent other mind-body practices, but she's been doing a lot of great work for many years now. So for some people, it was like a new thing. She was very young, it was kind of a launching. For other people, they just kept kind of what they were doing, blogging, nothing really shifted. Some people, like Tommy Rosen and Michael Stone, were very well established. So this was just kind of one more thing they did, so it was like a whole mix. But I would say for many people, things started to, it helped them in whatever work they were doing individually, if they weren't already well established in particular. And for me and Roseanne, it was, the reception was very positive. I mean, people were interested. It was kind of the first book like that. Now there's quite a few in terms of collected essays that look at yoga, not just sort of like, how do you want to practice asana at home, or it was not a practice book. It was more of a, I guess you could say, socio-cultural kind of look through the lens of personal experience, but trying to use that as an entree into talking about something that's happening society-wide, right? So that was new at that time. And so there was a lot of interest. I was surprised, honestly. Like, I didn't think that it would be as well received as it was. So
Well, I think
it's great.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, it was very much a moment, and because it captured the spirit of that, it really did channel something. And what it channeled for me was the idea that I'd been tentatively feeling for, but not really been able to articulate, that there was something wrong in the yoga world that I was part of, that just didn't really add up. And I remember discussing it with a friend I used to go to yoga classes with, and we would say, where's the community here? We would go to these sort of really intense experiences for 90 minutes, chat while we tied our shoelaces, maybe go for a drink or some food, and then disappear. And that was the end of yoga. And I thought, well, where's the community here? And both Michael Stone and Matthew Remsky, also in a slightly different way, with a somewhat prescriptive title, if I remember rightly, or certainly conclusion,
Right.
saying that if a yoga studio doesn't have a soup kitchen in it, it's basically failed in its raison d'etre. And yet, that did speak to me. It seemed like, well, if this is supposed to be doing us all some good, it's the only good that it does us that we, feel more self-content in our little bliss bubbles, or is it actually going to ripple out into achieving some sort of positive social change, as you put it earlier? And those questions were not things that people in the yoga teaching world, that certainly I was part of, wanted to talk about. And I felt that was, again, really missing. If a yoga teacher was a Dharma teacher rather than an asana teacher, I felt that was something that should be coming out of their mouths. Dharma, the right way to live, what's sort of conducive to collective benefit. And that's the tradition out of which yoga stems. And people like to talk all this sort of fancy discourse around what it might do. And, that wasn't quite there. And you, in your book, Yoga PhD, at the beginning, I think I mentioned in an email I sent you the other day, had really zeroed in on that right at the beginning of your preface, saying, really wanted to inquire into, what happens as a result of this personal transformation, whether it also transforms relationships and society.
Right.
And you went on yourself to become involved in basically activist projects, looking at how yoga could be part of contributing to positive social change, and yet at the same time, before very long, stepped away from all of that. So I'm curious as to what it was in trying to put those ideas into practice that turned you off.
Yeah, well, so starting where we left off, or where I left off with the 21st Century Yoga book, it is true that that book was very consciously, on the part of me and Roseanne, the editors, a mix of criticism about what was happening in the yoga world, but also kind of positive inspiration about the possibilities and positive benefits that people were really receiving. So we tried to really balance those things. And I think that was pretty successful. So that was always my goal, really, was to address this kind of, at that time, profound and widespread reluctance to think about yoga in more of a societal context, sort of beyond the project of the self, And there was a lot of resistance to that among people who were just in this kind of discussion that had kind of emerged online. Like, I remember writing something about, why it could be considered part of your yoga practice to think about these kind of issues, about how this was interfacing with society and even politics. I got a lot of pushback on that. People just at that time thought a lot of people thought, like, that's just not what this is about.
Politics should be kept out of yoga.
And in certain ways I've kind of come to think they were right, but but maybe for different reasons. So in the discussions that were happening, these issues were being raised. B. Schofield's essay in 21st Century Yoga was actually very interesting on this front, because, well, at that time it was he, but now she wrote about how becoming proficient in any sort of spiritual practice should not be thought to give you any insight whatsoever into political, social, cultural issues of the day. These are very different pursuits. And it also doesn't automatically make you sort of a good person. like that's the realm of ethics. And I remember when she had also been we excerpted things and put out. That was probably the most controversial essay in that book, because people at that time, including me, sort of had this mindset of like, wow, this is doing all this great stuff for us. So obviously the next step is simply to make it more prevalent in society, make it more accessible, bring it to places where people wouldn't normally have access. And then, we'll do all these great things for more people and therefore socially. And, it's just kind of a natural snowball effect, right? And B's essay said, not so fast. These are really some very different pursuits. And she got a lot of pushback, and I think time proved that she was right. But anyway, backing up, so I did the books, and those were well received. And then the next step in terms of this integrating yoga into society and politics that happened for me was Roseanne actually suggested that we go to the Yoga Service Council conference as press. And she said, Carol, if we write to the Omega Institute where it was happening, it was being hosted in New York, and say like, we'll blog about this and we're the press, right? They'll cover our, they didn't cover our travel, but they'll cover all our tuition and room and board. It's a great deal. We should do it. And I was like, really? Wow. Okay. That was a new thought to me. And sure enough, she was 100% right. I contacted them. Sure, great, come, comp you room and board, the fee, whatever. So I just had to get to New York. And so we both went together it was maybe the first or second of the big conferences they had. It might have been the first. And I was just so taken with it. She was a little more skeptical, but I was just like, this is what I've been looking for. And what it was the Omega Institute, which is one of these places kind of like Kripalu or Esalen, they host all these sort of yoga and meditation and new age and spiritual and this, that, and the other thing, holistic health retreats, right? And they saw that there was this emerging world of either nonprofit organizations, if they had gotten that far, or just like entrepreneurial individuals who were doing things like teaching yoga in prisons, teaching yoga to homeless youth. They were starting to form little organizations like Street Yoga, Prison Yoga Project, this and that. It was kind of out there, but it was all very disparate, disconnected. And so the Omega Institute, I can't really credit who it was exactly, how this happened. But they called some of the people together who were prominent in this emerging field. It wasn't really a field, this kind of universe of interest, and said, you guys can come together free to Omega for, I don't know if it was a week or 2 weeks or whatever, and figure out something. Like, we'll support you, right? And so out of that emerged the Yoga Service Council. And I went as a writer to one of their conferences, and I just was totally taken with it. It was like, here's all the people who are actually figuring out ways to concretely do all these things that I had been interested in a more general, abstract way about bringing yoga into society, where it's not just about sort of having a cool yoga body and like, I don't know, your best perfect life, but it was really about helping people with addiction, with eating disorders, with an unjust criminal justice system, with managing a difficult public school situation, helping veterans with post-traumatic stress. I mean, all these kind of things, people who had connections to those different fields were starting to try to systematize it. So the Omega Institute provided a big institutional sponsor to help make this more of a thing, more of a field. We always talking about building a field. And
Mm.
so after I had written these, glowing reviews, basically, about what they were doing, eventually they asked me to be on their board of directors. And so I was totally thrilled. And so I joined the board of directors of the Yoga Service Council. And I just started devoting a lot of time and energy to trying to help build that organization, and was very involved with it for quite a few years. I became like the vice president or something. And my biggest role concretely was helping with their best practices book series. So
Mm.
I did the writing and editing and kind of pulling together for 2 books in a series. The first one, which I was not involved with, except as like a reviewer of a manuscript, was Best Practices for Yoga in Schools. And then the next 2 I worked on were Best Practices for Yoga with Veterans and Best Practices for Yoga in the Criminal Justice System.
Mm.
So that was really great, interesting work, because for each book, the Omega Institute would again offer their facilities for free. And so we'd have these 5-day or so retreats. And so we could invite like 30 people who all say worked with veterans with yoga and mindfulness, or just at the VA, but we're sympathetic, and tried to get a whole mix of people, conduct these brainstorming sessions about what really works best, distill all that information down in the form of notes, and then that would be funneled to the editor, in those cases me, and turned into a book. So I did those, and in terms of how I got out of it, it's not, I mean, the experiences I had, sure, there were all these things I'm talking about. As in life, always, there's always some, personality conflicts with this person, or that goes wrong, or whatever.
Mm.
But on the whole, I remain very positive about those experiences. I mean, I think they were great. I value them. I got a lot out of it. Hopefully other people did as well. Those books are still out there. Really, when I soured on the whole thing, was things that were happening, not on my particular projects, but in the larger sphere. So like in the yoga world, the whole online discussion that had created this very robust, fertile, creative blogosphere I talked about, more and more got leverage for takeover by certain entrepreneurial kind of activist / troll types, and there were different
It's a good
waves.
term.
Like first there was kind of the Hindu nationalist wave, and I think Prime Minister Modi's election in India really kind of shifted the politics of yoga for people who are connected with that world, like what do they call them, non-resident Indians,
Yeah.
in the North American and maybe also British, I don't know, sphere. And people there, it was a, kind of like, we're going to reclaim yoga, you need to be Hindu, et cetera, et cetera. So there was some of those people, and they would just be online all the time and like insert themselves in every discussion and like push, 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 and insist, and and then then there was the wave of the North American sort of new, I don't know, like new social justice, AKA woke, we would say now, we didn't use that word then, types who were very aggressive about certain issues that could overlap with the right-wing Hindu nationalist types, like cultural appropriation being a prime one. And so who are very aggressive in terms of kind of like, we're going to take over these spaces, we're going to control this discourse, we're going to shut down people who we deem to be saying the wrong things. So there was this whole very aggressive wave. And of course, this was bigger than just the yoga world. It probably came to the yoga world a little later than in certain other sectors. But the whole internet shifted, and people figured out, like, it's pretty easy to really have power beyond your numbers if you're online all the time and you're ruthless.
Yep.
You can really, a small number of people can control a much larger number of people, because most people don't want to engage in conflict, and if they feel that saying the wrong thing could get them attacked, they'll back down because they're, just not looking for a fight, right? So if people are out there looking for a fight and looking to take over, they can do that pretty easily, and they did. So that kind of shut down that whole world. And then in the yoga service world, that had been initially a very pragmatic sort of approach. It was very much a sort of what works. Like, you have to understand these systems. Like, if we're going to talk about yoga in schools, like the people who did that book had worked in schools. You need to talk to the principals. You need to think about the student bodies. You need to like kind of do a social sciencey study of the place you want to work, figure out what works, figure out how to do the, figure out how, like, what's the best way to train teachers to work in these. It was very down to earth, very pragmatic. It wasn't particularly ideological. It was more informed by a sort of vaguely, sort of left of center, like, we feel good about the idea of working in large scale social institutions, but I don't know. I wouldn't say it was particularly political in any sort of ideological way. It was very pragmatic, and I liked that, because I think you should try and know what you're doing. But then there was this whole wave of very ideological politics, sort of disconnected with and not really interested in on the ground realities, which just have kind of swept through the culture. And I think it swept through the yoga world very much as well. So, I've kind of pulled back, but I have from afar sort of had the sense that there's been the same polarization that's hit so many societies, and certainly where I live in the United States, us very strongly. There's been this sort of polarization where people feel like there's only two ways of thinking about the world on pretty much anything social. There's sort of, in my country, the blue states and the red states, the Democrats and the Republicans, the left and the right, and they have become very I know less about what's happened on the right-wing side of that, but what I saw, because I've always lived in a more progressive blue state, they call it here, world, that's my world. I saw that world become infested with a high level of groupthink, a high level of ideological conformity, a high level of ideological sort of hashtag-driven thinking, and a reluctance to think about the world in the complexity as it really presents itself, and a desire to just like stick with sort of the slogan of the day. And so I think a lot of that infested the yoga world as well. And that combined with a sort of activist trolling to sort of leverage certain people out and others in. So I definitely had quite a few waves of, attacks. Not as bad as some people, for sure, but it was unpleasant. And, I wasn't making much money at all this. It was all just kind of a passion project, on the whole. So I got to a certain point, it was like, why am I doing this? And I had answered a lot of the questions I had personally, and it had really shifted more to the Yoga Service Council work. There were other people who had more energy to take the ball and run with it that I did. I was a little burnt out. I also had some family kind of crises and demands that were demanding my time that I wanted to be able to really focus on. So I just got to a point where it's like, okay, I'll finish up this best practices for yoga in the criminal justice system book. I had committed to marketing it. Jennifer Cohen Harper, who had been leading the Yoga Service Council, had a second child, and it was like, I can't devote so much time to this. She has a whole other business of her own. So she was stepping down, and I could have taken over. I was like, I don't want to, but I'll help with a transition. So I helped with that. And then I just kind of backed out. And really what I was interested in then in terms of writing was much more trying to figure out like what the hell just happened, not so much only in the yoga world, but with Trump's election in the United States, with this sea change, in terms of the political cultural environment, it was quite quick and quite dramatic. And, I found, and I have continued to find, that the world that I used to kind of consider like my natural home base in my culture, sort of the progressive left, whatever, I just don't really like it anymore, So I've had to kind of and I've had to kind of reorient, and I got real turned off by all the nastiness. That's what I left out also. There was that whole wave of exposés about abuses of power by leaders in the yoga world and also the meditation world. That was extremely disillusioning. I mean, I knew there was some, right? But the extent of it, I really did not know. And it really was a wake-up call in terms of what I'd mentioned before about, at the time, B. Schofield's controversial essay that, sort of becoming more adept at some of these practices does not necessarily translate into any sort of, like profoundly good ethical practices, let alone insight into society, culture, political issues of the day. Like these are different realms. And I really saw how much the power corrupted successful leaders in these worlds that were supposed to be sort of above that. They weren't. And, I was still naive enough that came as a shock and a surprise. It was very disillusioning. And it, and then there was kind of the counterwave of like, it was good that all this was exposed, right? It needed to be. That was extremely important. But then there was sort of the counterwave, and this also happened in the larger society about, like Me Too, for example, like everybody's got to have their platform for being a victim now, Me Too, Me Too. I mean, it's kind of like, I'm going to sound like reactionary, don't clip this, but like that slogan, honestly, sort of encapsulates a lot of what I don't like about what happened. It's like, my sense of a personal slight is just as important as like this incredibly dramatic story of, horrific abuse. No, it's not. Sorry, it's just not. Like you have to be able to differentiate. And I feel like all of that kind of got lost. Not everybody. There were far too many people who wanted sort of their 15 minutes of fame as some sort of like wronged person. And I hate it. So
well, in that context as well, some of the people who were going around, in some ways doing good work by trying to draw attention to all of the abusing were behaving quite abusively themselves.
Exactly. Yes. And all that was happening in a context where more and more you're supposed to play along with this presumption that kind of infected society, that there's only good guys and bad guys. Like you're on the team good guy or you're on the team bad guy. That's all there is. That's just like, no, that's ridiculous. Sorry. And so yeah, it just left very little room. I mean, in general, this is a problem for me that extends far beyond yoga. I mean,
Oh, of
it
course.
just,
Mm.
yeah, it leaves very little room for the sort of um, discussions, perspectives, and even ways of being in the world that I value, and so it's, obviously many people have struggled with these kind of things in many different contexts, but I think the yoga world um, was so far from being immune to these broader problems, almost the opposite. Like it's almost because you have people, or at least the part of the yoga world that I was involved in, that people are doing more than just going to their class and living their lives. It's more
Yeah.
central to their work, to their identity, and so on. It's almost like the people who are kind of primed to um, want something bigger in their lives, which is a often beautiful thing, but they can be more susceptible to these kind of waves of, the zeitgeist of some sort of stupid ideology that really, um, if you thought about it and parsed it more carefully and rationally, it would be clear that it's really not worth believing in. But it's not about that. It's about having a sense of purpose and meaning and faith that you're part of this thing, and these waves come through. And I had an earlier wave that worked for me that I really liked, what I talked about with the blogging and the books and the yoga service stuff, and that wave ended. And the new wave that came in, I didn't like,
Well,
you
that
know.
is, that I think the distinction between those two waves is really, I think, encapsulated in this term that you've I don't know if you've personally come up with it, but I certainly first encountered it reading your Substack Liberal Confessions, post-liberal progressivism.
Mm,
So the ostensible pursuit of what in America gets called liberalism, the values of social progress, and the idea that constructive and positive social change is a desirable thing that we should be working towards, as opposed to trying to conserve things the way that they are for fear of losing your power, was being
yeah,
pursued in a way that was the antithesis of liberal. It was not about inquiry and conversation and sifting, as you say, of evidence to try and find what turned out to be the most effective thing based on something you could defend. Instead, it was defending a principle based on believing that you're almost divinely right and that anybody who disagrees is inherently evil. And in the first wave you're talking about of online conversation, there was a lot of good-natured disagreement in which people were having these endless exchanges in blog comment threads where they weren't on the same page, but they didn't need to demonize each other for holding a contrary opinion. And that started to change. And particularly in that post-Me Too moment, I was at the time closely involved with an Ashtanga teacher who was coming under a lot of pressure to conform to certain, ways of demonstrating atonement for the misdeeds of Patabi Joys. And
yeah,
there was never really any space at that time to just talk about anything else related to that guy, such as, for example, that she herself had not been abused by him, or that
yeah,
had never seen anything like that, or in fact that there hadn't been a conversation that she'd hushed up for her students. All of that was just unsayable for a certain amount of time. Let alone that it might be a matter of individual choice whether or not you want to keep pictures of the guy in your building, and whether
right.
people who decide they don't like that might just be able to leave the building and go somewhere else. Instead, it was all about follow the list of correct responses, otherwise you're a terrible person. And that seems to be the nature of this groupthink that you've described in various ways in some of what you've been reflecting on, that there is this sort of revealed truth of how we ought to behave. And that starts to sound like religion.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there's a lot of people out there who have latched on to there's kind of a list of principles around the whole intersectional social justice kind of wave, who've really latched onto that, with the best of intentions. Often, they
Of course.
believe this stuff, right? And I think in part, some of the people who, like me, don't believe it, I think are often people who had some other perspective that they developed over a long period of time. I studied political science and academia and PhD, like I've taught, so like you have all already in your mind all these other frameworks. And while I have questioned a lot of those, it's not like, oh, I was right then, and that's it. Like I've really come to see how a lot of those ideas were themselves bound up with earlier waves of, like, I really came of age in the 90s. I was going into academia. If you were a college educated person in the United States, kind of on an upward professional trajectory in the 90s, it was a very hopeful, positive time. There was just like this wave, kind of opposite of now. Like now there's a lot of people who, regardless of their education, or maybe even more so if you're more educated, have this kind of apocalyptic doom, sense, are very negative. Everything is like, down to the very language we use, systemic racism and oppression of this or that sort, right? I would say at that time, when I more came of age, there was a very optimistic view that a lot of social problems could and would be tackled. The Berlin Wall had just come down, everything was opening up, the internet was just starting, the American economy was booming, we had a balanced budget. At that time, we liked Bill Clinton. That's changed, and or liked him enough. There were always criticism from the left, but the tenor of it, there was, in my world, and a very hopeful, positive, onwards and upwards. And looking back, because I've spent a lot of time thinking, like, okay, like this kind of collapse of the sort of liberal progressive project I was a part of in the yoga world and beyond it, into this more, what I call post-liberal progressive, which is just sort of a more technical way of talking about what in a more negative way you'd call wokeism, or in a more positive way you might call social justice activism, but it's something very new, in terms of its force and velocity in society. There's no way that this former kind of culture, let's say political culture I was part of, could have collapsed as seemingly rapidly as it did, unless it had already been, over a long period of time, rotting. Like, the structure was not sound. That's why it fell down like a house of cards, and I didn't see as clearly as I do now, at least as I think I do now. Maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't see those things at the time. You know what I mean? Like in the 90s, I wasn't thinking about NAFTA's impact on rural and small town America. I was living in a city. I didn't know much about it. I wasn't from a little manufacturing town in, Tennessee or something, where I saw like all the jobs go away. But those people, became Trump voters. But I was not aware of that, right? And it wasn't really on my radar screen. Like, we were talking about welfare reform, other issues. And so I've tried to kind of self-critique in the sense of, like, what was I not seeing that helps explain why this kind of, I don't know, like aspirational politics that I felt a part of for so long just collapsed. Because I think it's collapsed. Not everybody thinks that, but I think the people who don't think that are fooling themselves. Honestly, I think there's been a sea change, and the internet is also, it's transforming everything. So that was a part of it, but yeah, I've done a lot of rethinking, and this is all kind of going far away from the yoga world, but I think in the yoga world, obviously, there was a lot that people were not questioning sufficiently either, that you can look back and you can say, like, well, why did these cults of personality build up to the point where they became these kind of empires of abuse? Like, there were certain ideas and circulation there and certain ways of relating to each other, certain assumptions that at the time nobody was really bringing into sharp focus and looking at. And then it kind of undermined the whole thing until it just, like, all those authority figures got exposed and fell down, and was this sort of wave of reaction of, like, now, you got to prove your bona fides as, like, an enlightened person by reciting our list of, hashtag slogans or something. That's not really, I mean, neither one is where I would want to be, but it kind of lost my train of thought here. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I felt in the yoga world and more broadly, things change very quickly. I've been trying to figure out kind of why, but I've been focused more on American politics for that than yoga. I think within the yoga world, there's, for somebody like me, there was a lot of disillusionment. And so I wanted to back away to, in part, also sort of be able to reconnect with the things that got me excited about it in the first place, which is more the very personal practice and benefits that one experiences. And it was kind of impossible to do that when I was, like, dealing with, onslaughts of, like, trolling, attacking, social justice warriors and Hindu nationalists. And it was just like this world, and then in the meantime, there's sort of the corporate commercialization of yoga studios taking over, and all the, like, cool little studios that I like are sort of falling, and yeah, it was just like I couldn't really enjoy is the wrong word, like, what had been a really personally transformative, that word is overused, but it was a personally transformative practice for me, became so tainted with all these things that I disliked that, like, I just couldn't access that anymore. Rather than accessing sort of the mind body connection, I'm thinking about all this shit. So I wanted to, I wanted to get out.
No, I hear you. And I'd like to come back to your practice and how yoga looks to you today in a moment. But first, I just want to rewind. Looking back to, you've cited the example of NAFTA's impact, for example, on poor people and what that does to their voting intentions. But the thing I was always struck by, I'm a former journalist, and I spent a lot of time observing how things were framed in the media. And part of the reason I think you probably didn't hear about that was because it wasn't presented that way in the New York Times, for example. And all the time that a conversation is skewed in a particular way, there's almost a growing blind spot that people are incapable of perceiving, and attempting to point it out immediately casts you as some deplorable over there who's part of another perspective, because you're not accepting the chosen kind of party line, and it's not even understood to be a party line. And I saw all that inside the New York Times around the invasion of Iraq, with people sort of coughing uncomfortably, refusing to talk about it. I was a young idealistic reporter who was also a little bit troubled and smoking too much weed, and I just thought, to hell with this nonsense. But I then spent a very weird phase of my life spending a lot of time online right at the beginning of blogging, 2004, locked up indoors, unemployed, getting high all the time, and harassing journalists, basically doing this kind of stuff that took over the yoga world 15 years earlier, by convincing myself, that I had understood what was wrong. I spent a long time trying to get commissioned by mainstream news outlets to write about why they were corrupt, which unsurprisingly, none of them wanted to pay me to do. But there was this mentality of, if we could just sort of reorient thinking this way, it would fix all the problems. But in that time, I was exposed to a lot of alternative media that I hadn't really been reading, because I didn't even know it existed, because I'd been part of the corporate monolith, and I'd sort of always thought of those as the great unwashed who peddle conspiracy theories, and more and more we become aware of the fact that there are people who don't fit into the conventional idea of what's acceptable to discuss, who aren't stupid or ill-informed, but actually have,
Right.
you know, footnoted research that you can go look at and check out for yourself and start to think, you know, independently. And, you know, I think in the yoga world, to come back to the second strand of what you're saying, there were a lot of self-appointed experts who popped up and basically, again, sort of mimicked the behavior of what they were critiquing, forming little sort of personality cults of, you know, join my way of seeing things. I've got all of the eloquent ways of expressing what's wrong, but don't criticize me, or don't try to have a conversation about whether this is the right thing to do. Almost join my troll army and go and be nasty
Right.
to these people. And
Right.
that
I
was
mean,
what
it's a
I was
good
doing
market
before.
strategy.
No, I mean it is, but you know, there's a lot of people who do that and don't even get
Yeah.
rich off it. It just
Yeah.
fulfills a human need. So I guess you know, come back to where we started about the capacity to change.
Yeah.
Why didn't yoga help some of these people to see a bit more clearly through their own illusions? Isn't that the point?
Yeah. Um, you know, I've come to think that yoga, um, thinking of it as like kind of when we say that, thinking about all the things that are offered, ranging from, you know, your classes at the corporate yoga studio in your neighborhood to reading sacred texts that were written, you know, thousands of years ago. And there's so many things. Um, it's sort of like any other semi-equivalent world of institutions, practices, ideas, resources. Consider, for example, Christianity. Okay, so there's all these churches of different types, there's books, there's theologians, there's different types of prayer, there's this and that. And certain, like, there's nothing more automatic about the process of becoming a more enlightened, better person by practicing asana, or even reading these texts or studying them, than there is by going and sitting in the church pew and singing some hymns. You know, I mean, it's like for some people, some individuals will take, they're looking for that part of the tradition that they can really take the ball and run with it and grow. And in all these traditions, there's a lot there. But other people, for whatever reason, they're not at the moment. Maybe they will later, or they're getting certain things out of it and not others. Or it's a vehicle for advancing your career, or just fulfilling some social needs, or in the case of yoga, maybe some physical needs, or whatever. I mean, there's all sorts of things, but there's just nothing, it all has to come from you, is basically. And I think there's also a certain mystery about why are certain people more driven to, in whatever tradition or world of, you know, sort of potential personal, spiritual, psychological growth that they are connecting with. I mean, you could say the same for something like the world of psychotherapy or whatever. There's a lot of great work. Why are some people going to be able to encounter that? And really, everyone's going to make mistakes and do dumb things, but essentially they're kind of looking to separate the wheat from the chaff and nourish themselves, you know. And then other people, you know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? I mean, it's just not, that's not the way it's going to go. And I think I thought back when I was getting into the yoga stuff that yoga was different because, as I understood it at the time, I thought of it as something that was a set of practices that could systematically take everyone who just wanted to engage with it out of a sort of more particular cultural framework. You didn't have to believe in certain doctrines. It was experiential, right? so that you could be, and this was also the way these, sort of 20th century gurus like Iyengar and others kind of marketed it. Like you could be a Christian or a Hindu or a Buddhist or an atheist or whatever, and you could kind of come together through these, sort of semi-scientific practices, learn how to do certain things, and you could come to a sort of common ground experientially of something deeply positive, like a sort of, I don't know, cosmic consciousness or whatever. Like it's hard to say exactly what the right words are, but a sort of ground of consciousness that was in and of itself positive, healing, generative, and good, right? And that you could have these steps to get there. And then you could go back to your traditions. You could continue to be a Christian or a sort of secular humanist or a political activist or whatever, or just a mom or whatever it was in your regular life, kind of nourished by that experience and do better in that realm. And so I saw it as a sort of non-ideological, sort of something that would transcend cultural differences, right? And that was why I thought in my sort of 1990s formed very positive about multiculturalism and democracy has to, and I mean I still think it should, but I was more hopeful about it. Democracy has to move into this direction where in the US, for example, it's less Eurocentric. It doesn't have to trash and demonize those traditions of European democracy and enlightenment and so on, but it has to be inclusive of the wisdom of other peoples, other faiths, other traditions. It has to be much more inclusive, and that would be enriching for everybody. But in order to do that and kind of get past our differences, yoga meditation could be really useful precisely because it's kind of a systematic way of getting to that mental space where you feel part of something that's universal, but it transcends the particular, but then you can go back to the particular, right? I thought of it as sort of a technology almost for this that, more people could access. So that all kind of makes sense intellectually, but it's really not the way that people work in practice. I guess I've come to see, like, we're much more driven by, I think, our social worlds, and we're very deeply influenced by sort of the shared meanings that we have intersubjectively, and those have to kind of map on in some meaningful way to make sense of our material conditions, right? So this is social science talk, but hopefully you can follow it. But it's very, like, it's much more powerful, like, make it more concrete. I think understanding more realistically human beings, to me at this point, I would say the experience of, say, a transcendent moment, like I was talking about in a yoga class or whatever, or on your own practice, or learning how to do that. For most people in the bigger scheme of their lives, that's valuable, but it's probably not going to be as important as, like, when you're interacting with your peers in the workplace or socially or whatever, of sort of fitting in and sharing a sense of, like, we have a shared world that I'm a part of that makes sense to us, and we're kind of the good guys. Like, you want to feel good about yourselves. So that's a more powerful need. And I think a lot of what's happening, with this polarization and so on is there's just so many incentives to sort of be part of your social world. And I know I have felt extremely troubled by my sort of apostasy with my, sort of blue state progressive liberal culture. It's very hard, like, to, sort of not feel a part, like everybody is just like into bashing Trump, into like, and just like following kind of, it's better now, but sort of following like the story, the narrative about, how to think about Russia, how to think about Ukraine, how to think about COVID, how to think about transgenderism, how to think about, like, there's just like check, like all these things. And if you're not with the program of your surrounding peer group, it's hard. I mean, it's just like there's a strong incentive. I have to, you kind of wonder like what's wrong with you, like that you're not just, it's very powerful. And so, I mean, this is just off the top of my head, but I think that, in a nutshell, my vision of how yoga and meditation, mindfulness, all those kind of things would kind of provide this common ground of deeply positive, regenerative, consciousness expanding experience for people, and making that more accessible, and that would sort of naturally change things. That was not really rooted in a fully realistic assessment of, I mean, human nature isn't a popular term, but I'll use it like sort of what people are like, human nature. Like it was too, I don't know, it was too idealistic. That's what I would say.
Would it be going too far to say that we're still living in tribes?
Well, I think if we were living in tribes, we'd have a very different sort of subjectivity or, sense of ourselves in the world, and we might be a lot more comfortable, honestly. So I think almost like, I always think the problem is the opposite, in a sense that we are so, we're all supposed to be these kind of flourishing individuals, who, sort of, you do you, like, live your best life, do all this stuff, and kind of distinguish yourself and feel fulfilled. Like, so there's very high expectations for the individual self, but that's supposed to happen in a world where it's incredibly competitive. The pressures of everyday life in terms of making a living for the vast majority of people are actually worse now than they were, in recent memory. So that's hard practically and also psychologically and emotionally. Traditions have crumbled. So like, unless you're ensconced in something like a observant Jewish community or a traditional Catholic community or Hindu, whatever, some sort of, and I do know people who are like this. Most of us have kind of either grown up or for several generations or in our own lives moved away from any sort of established, religion, framework of meaning. The yoga world is sort of, it didn't evolve into something, cohesive, stable, like as 21st century yoga essays, we were talking about, was sort of envisioning like, how could this kind of be a replace? It didn't. Instead, it sort of got sucked into the capitalist marketplace and the kind of cultural fragmentation and the political polarization. That's not to say on your own or in small groups or with certain teachers, you can't continue to have amazing, profound, worthwhile experiences, but as a social force, no, it didn't move in the way that some of us hoped and imagined, right? And so there's not those traditions. Gender roles, obviously, totally shifted in terms of, who you're supposed to be as a wife, daughter, mother, woman, like all that. And for men as well, obviously, sort of crumbled, internet, like fire hose of nonstop information. You hear about news all over the world all the time. Anyway, et cetera, you get the idea. It's like, so I think, so you take human beings that in a tribal society, you would have a bounded group of people, everybody, your social world would be almost predetermined. Maybe there's certain exceptional people who become the leader or the shaman or whatever. But by and large, it's like, you know who you are, you know what you're supposed to do, you know who your people are, you know what your traditions are. And, absent some sort of hugely disruptive, which of course always happened, war or plague or famine or natural disaster, whatever, like your psychic world is stable and reliable. And now we have sort of the opposite, right? You're like, just to make sense of the world and find your way in it is extremely hard. And at the same time, you're sort of raised to think that you by yourself, in isolation, without any of these social supports, without any stable framework of meaning, without institutions that you can rely on, are supposed to like flourish. And it's just not realistic. So this is sort of the undermining of liberalism too. It's just like there's some interesting conversations going on just about, some of the ideals of liberalism as in liberal democracy, not just like free marketeerism, but liberating the individual to be their best self by taking down all structures, whether of meaning or of institution that could get in your way. Like maybe that project has just gone to a point where what we really have is just too much atomization of the self, which produces mental illness, which produces, these kind of reactive groupthink movements to like hold on to something that seems stable, but it's very shallow in terms of its structure of meaning and even like social longevity. I mean, like look at the BLM movement in the US. Like we had the biggest protest ever after George Floyd's murder. And a crying need for generations for serious criminal justice reform. And what happened is like a flash in a pan. It's like this organization came by, scooped up all this corporate money. Most of it, no one knows what happened to it. They became very discredited. Everyone went home and moved on to the next thing. And so like for a moment, it was so meaningful and people felt like, I have to be part of this. It's going to change everything. But it was very shallow. It was like a slogan, a movement, an organization with no accountability structure, ephemeral. There's just too much of that. And so I think you have human beings who might be hardwired over tens of thousands of years to live in a tribal situation, and all of a sudden are in this like postmodern, I don't know, like internet fueled, like what's reality, AI is coming, climate change, sort of like, and so I think that tribalism is really more of a reaction to a situation that's developed socially that's incredibly difficult for people to navigate, and the demands on people are just brutal, right? In terms of sort of both the practicalities when it comes to sort of making a living, but even more so, I mean, I think just making a self, I mean, it's just like the rates of mental illness, whatever you want to call it. I think that's almost like too clinical a term, but extreme distress among younger generations who came into this 21st century world without, like somebody like me who's old, has the benefit of sort of having come up with a more optimistic world and a more stable economy and just more stable meanings. Like when I grew up, it was still normal for liberal Protestants to go to church. I mean, I was just like, my mom was like, you just have to go because that's what you do. Like, you don't have to believe it. It's just, you need to learn those stories. It was just kind of part of like, I just feel like there was still more of that. And there's just been a lot of very, very, very rapid change. And I think that makes it very hard. You have these demands to make your best life, on your own, but the circumstances in which you have to do that are unprecedented and they're very difficult for most people. And some people, sure, they can do that and thrive in these conditions, but I don't think they're working. I don't think that it's working for most people.
No, I would agree with you. And obviously in that context, this rather dystopian horror that you've described quite well for us, expecting a little bit of yoga is somehow going to fix everything is almost an insult to people who are suffering under the weight of all of that. But at the same time, it is still helpful. And I wonder, therefore, just to conclude, what yoga means for you now and how that relates to the rest of your life.
I'm still working through that, but I would say that I see yoga as a set of practices and studies and traditions that I feel have enriched my life enormously and that I continue to draw from. And I think that the main difference for me now, as opposed to like when I was most idealistic about it and most involved, is that I think at that point, I would have kind of tried to put everything into the framework of yoga. Like I wanted to put my, sort of political aspirations into that framework. I wanted to put my writing into that framework. I wanted to put, sort of think of everything I was interested in, psychology in that framework, physical health, spirituality, it would all kind of go funnel into yoga, right? And I wouldn't do that now. I don't think it would necessarily be wrong for somebody else because there's so much there, I think depending on how you encounter it, you could easily spend your whole life within the world of yoga and continue to benefit. But for me personally, I kind of, I have certain things I've always been interested in. I've always been interested in the socio-political world, particularly sort of my own country's democratic aspirations. I mean, I'm probably more disillusioned now than I ever have been, but I can't help but still retain some interest. I almost wish I didn't. And I've always been very interested in, for lack of a better term, holistic health and spirituality. I mean, I was allergic to it before, as I described, but there was always that there. It's more I had to get comfortable with it. And yoga really was the biggest catalyst for that. And so now I think I'm just trying to say, and I'm very family oriented. I mean, I have 2 children. I've been married for almost 30 years. I'm very, very family oriented. That's very important to me. So I'm trying to just more develop a sort of acceptance of, for whatever reason, I have a certain constellation of things that I keep being interested in. That's just how it is. I want to try to sort of remain open to the deepest positive, generative aspects of life that I can, so not to become embittered and negative and depressed and all that, and to be on the lookout for that. So I would consider that sort of a broad-based spiritual commitment, right? And that I feel like I have personally also, since I did grow up going to the church, liberal Protestant church, I mean, it wasn't any sort of heavy religious upbringing by any means, but I have certain ways of thinking about deep questions that definitely come from the Christian tradition. I'm interested in re-exploring some of those, again. And yoga is more something I need to do to feel good in my body. I just really need it, the asana practice. And I also need the mind stilling, practices of a more meditative approach to asana, if not a seated meditation, if not prayer type things from a different tradition. But I feel those things are really vital, right? And that I've felt a lot freer to mix. Like I used to just like kind of had to be yoga, but now it's sort of like, well, I saw a physical therapist who was really great for a while, and I learned certain things that are really helpful with like my hips bother a certain imbalance. Like I can mix that in with more asana. It doesn't have to be like this pure thing. It's like the larger point is sort of cultivating the best life encounter with life that I can, right? And so there's no reason to have to be a purist about like this has to be like stamped asana practice. As we know, like a lot of these asana practices were only developed in like the mid-20th century anyway. So what are we like, so it's like it's more the kind of bringing to working with your body, working with your mind, working with your breathing, that is going to enable you to encounter life in the best way that you possibly can for yourself and for others, right? And yoga is, I think, absolutely, a tremendous resource for that I continue to draw from, but I just no longer want to funnel everything into that or really anything, right? Like I just don't want to be any more sort of like, and in part maybe this is a reaction against the kind of group think, but I also think it's just aging. But I don't want to be like, I'm a yoga person, or I'm going to become a Christian now, or I'm a progressive. It's like, so I have to be XYZ. It's more like, no, I'm going to just use my more like these principles we talk about in yoga of sort of discernment and a sort of intuitive trust, of trying to that kind of separate out what is going to sort of help me to continue to grow in the best way I can and what's not. And so that is really the bigger commitment. And I just don't want it to be confined to any particular tradition anymore. But that said, I'm old, and so I wouldn't necessarily say for somebody who's a teenager or 20s or even their 30s that that's necessarily the best approach. Like I think it is good to delve into something deeply, like to really study, if you're into yoga, to really study that in depth. I mean, but I spent 15 years studying it in depth, so I kind of feel like, okay, I can move on. But like what I'm saying is like just skating around to whatever, like a water bug, is not really, that's not the message that I would want to give. It's more, you have different phases of life. And I think the phase of life when I was really immersed in yoga was, I still draw from and I am grateful for, but I just feel like I'm in a different phase of life now. I'm old, I'm in my 60s. So things have changed. So now I feel like I want to be in this more expansive, non-dedicated to a particular tradition place. But after having spent all this time saying how I think that's hard for people, I do think it's hard for people. And so I think if you can be part of some sort of tradition that offers important resources, it's much better to, particularly until you feel like you've kind of worked through that whole phase of getting what you can out of it, it's better to stick with it and like keep finding, you know, how you can grow within that until you just really naturally come to a place where you're like, okay, I mean, to grow now, I think I need to move to something else or supplement this, you know. But I do think, for example, like the work you're offering to people, making these yoga philosophies, whatever you want to call them, from the past much more accessible is very valuable. And I think people can learn a lot from, you know, pondering the questions that will arise for them if they start taking that information seriously, right? So yeah, so I do think that delving deep is good, but then also being willing to move on when it seems like it's time to do that, not be attached, right, is also good. So yeah, I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. It seems like a really
Mhm.
nice place to draw it to a close. Everything keeps changing, and it's how
Yeah,
we respond to that while we're still in a body and having to face it all. So, yeah,
right.
lots of really wise words that you've shared there, Carol. I really appreciate it. It's been a real pleasure to connect and to actually speak rather than just typing. So, thank you again for taking the time.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you. Thanks again.
Okay.